Well, I'll go ahead and get us started here. Thank you all for coming. I am Andrew Holland, Chief Operating Officer of the American Security Project. For those, I see some familiar faces, but for those of you who haven't joined us here before, brief introduction to ASP. We are a nonpartisan national security think tank focused on big picture, long-term issues. Today we're talking about public diplomacy, but we also focus on everything from broad national security strategy to energy and environmental policy to select bilateral relationships around the world. I'd encourage you all to go take a look on our website, americansecurityproject.org. Follow us on Twitter @AmSecProject and on Facebook as well. Got to get all of the whole web modern stuff out there. We are live streaming this, and thanks to those of you online for watching as well. It is an important topic that brings us here today to talk about America's role in the world. What do we communicate to the world? How do we do that? How do we make it most effective? I think this is something that's more important than ever. How we communicate is an important way of how we get what we want and how we impact our national security. And that's what ASP is here to do. We are now 15 years old, founded by a bipartisan group of senators and former senators. It was John Kerry and Chuck Hagel here when they were in the Senate, along with Gary Hart and Warren Rudman, said, shouldn't we have a bipartisan national security organization? And then to their credit, they kind of stepped back and let the national security professionals, the admirals, generals, former national security leaders on the board, including one of our board members here, Admiral Lee Gunn, thanks for being here with us, to take the lead on this issue. We pick and choose various issues where we can have a disproportionate impact based on our small size. We're not a big sort of Brookings Institution or anything like that. And we're not meant to be. We're meant to pick and choose deliberate, important areas where a common set of facts are really important. And so that's what we're trying to do. Today we're going to hear from a distinguished panel, but first we're going to hear from former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, also former senator and my former boss. It's always interesting for me to be on stage before him when I used to be standing behind him trying to keep him on script. And now I don't have to worry about that anymore, and I'll just say that it's a real honor to have you here with us, sir, and I could list out your long, distinguished career, but I think what I'll say is that there are few people in American public life who have done more to think long-term about America's national security throughout his career. Than Chuck Hagel. So thank you for being with us, and over to you, sir.
Andrew, thank you. I always did exactly as you told me. Occasionally would get a little far afield on script, but that's the nature of the business. Andrew Holland was a very valuable member of my staff, and years ago showed me and others in the Senate how intensely involved he was and concerned and interested in foreign policy and national security. So it is with great pride that I have watched him over the years ascend to some significant heights in this business, and he deserves every accomplishment. So, Andrew, thank you. Thank ASP. John Kerry and I were talking the other day about this organization, and we both agreed that this is an organization that has found a niche in this business. There are so many institutions that are really first-rate in this town and elsewhere that focus on America's role in the world, national security, intelligence, economics, trade, terrorism. But this one is really different from any other. And so I'm very proud, and I know John Kerry is too, to still be involved. And Admiral Gunn, good to see you again, and thank you for your early and continued leadership in this organization. Well, because Andrew is staring at me and making sure I don't go over my allotted time, I'm going to just make a couple of comments, because the panel that you're going to hear from is really a first-rate group of minds and thinkers, not just in the particular field of foreign policy, and I know that's broad and wide, and I'm going to address that in a minute, but the other dynamics that the panel bring to this issue is really worth your time, and I'm glad you're here, and thank you for coming. So I'm not going to trespass and take their time. And if you'd like, I'd be happy to, if it's appropriate, answer a couple of questions after my remarks. Well, let me begin this way. What you're going to hear today, and the report that ASP is releasing today, is not just about America's role in the world, not just about messaging, the specifics, chapter by chapter of foreign policy, national security, intelligence, all that's wrapped into that. It's really about everybody's interest, everybody's future, all 7 billion of us in the world today. We are a world, yes, of sovereign nations, of citizens of those sovereign nations, but clearly we are a world of global citizens, all 7 billion people, and the demographers tell us that by 2045, 2050, that we're going to put 2 billion more global citizens on the face of the earth. And if we're having some difficulties today getting along and making progress in the areas that we need to make progress on, whether it's climate change or any other issue, then we've got to start paying attention to how we're conducting ourselves, how we're governing ourselves, how we're respecting ourselves, and the day-to-day work of all of us, of all institutions. And so where I start is thinking about a book that I think many of you have read, most of you are aware of. It was Dean Acheson's book that he wrote about the 10 years following World War II. And those were the 10 years, as you all know, where we actually bolted together and created the liberal world order post-World War II. A fascinating book, because he talks about the great leaders from France and Germany, Great Britain, the United States, who all were instrumental in putting this world order together, and why they did it. And it is, I think, an anchor, a fundamental that we global citizens have somehow lost sight of and gotten away from over the years. And that anchoring fundamental that put together this world order was common interests. It was all about the common interests of all nations, of all people, all religions, all tribes. Not that we all believed the same way. That was not the purpose. But if we could build trusted, valued, credible international institutions that were based on the principle of common interests for all, economic development for all, jobs for all, education for all, opportunities for all, less war, less conflict. We could build those institutions based on what we agree on. Then we could use those as platforms to work out and address the things we don't agree on. But if we don't have a common denominator of common interest to start with where we agree, we'll never, ever solve the issues where we don't agree. There's no pathway to that. There's no structure or forum. I know in this town, systems and forums and structures are often poo-pooed. We have too many of those. Process doesn't matter. Well, process does matter. I've had a number of government jobs. I've had a number of private jobs. I guess I couldn't hold a job. But through that experience, I've understood how important process is. It's the only way to achieve a goal, an objective. There is no other way to do it. Now, totalitarian countries think differently. Mr. Xi thinks that's not quite right. Mr. Mussolini thought that. Hitler thought that. But that didn't end very well for them, nor the world. So I think as much as anything, what this paper that ASP is presenting, and I think what you'll hear from the panel, is going to talk about so many of those common interest features that it seems to me that we need to get back to. And one of those common interest features that is eroding, seriously eroding in the world, is steady, wise American leadership. When Andrew talks about role in the world, since World War II, that has been a constant. Steady, wise American leadership in the world. It's been the common denominator. It's been the center of gravity for all things. Not that the United States hasn't made mistakes. We have, and still do, and we'll make more. And we stumble, and we fail. But trust and confidence, as I once said, are the coins of the realm in your personal life, in anything. If you don't have trust and you don't have confidence in your government, in your leaders, in your institutions, in all of your life, you're headed for a lot of trouble, because then everything is uncertain, everything is volatile, everything is unpredictable. There's no certainty of fact. And much, again, of what ASP is talking about, has talked about, will talk about, are those facts. Climate change is a good example. I mean, I understand you do the difference in political thinking on that. I happen to know a little bit about that because Andrew recalls I was chairman of the Congressional Climate Change Commission, and I led our delegations to Kyoto in 1997, led our delegations, congressional delegations, the meetings all over the world. And they're within our group of Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, different opinions on it. But there was no difference of opinion on the fact that the climate was changing. And it was affecting economics, standards of living, quality of living, places in the world, security. Admiral Gunn can tell you all about what climate change is doing to our naval bases. And when you look ahead, projecting out the next 50 years, how we're going to have to change. So that's just but one example. So I, in conclusion, would say that we are all global citizens tied to each other. And the more we can appreciate that and understand that, and not walk away from your nation or the sovereignty or the pride you have in your country, but the fact that if we're to survive, not just as a sovereign nation, but to survive as a global citizen for the world, we're going to have to do better. And I don't know of a better starting point than the book that I recently just read again, Dean Acheson's book, President to Creation, because it is truly an instructive book on how to do it. Not easy, but it's how to do it. And I think the contribution, Andrew, that you and Matthew and General Cheney and all at ASP have made in the paper that I have just read that you'll be presenting is so critical to that point. How do we do this? How do we get back on track? And that's going to include all our citizens and all our leaders. So with that, I'd be happy, Andrew, to take a question. Or
I think we have a microphone, so bring that around, hands up, and please make your question in the form of a question, not a statement. Identify yourself, and we'll start with you, so wait for the microphone.
Yeah, I don't want any Joe Biden moment here. Just don't accuse my son of anything, and we'll be all right.
Hello, my name is Daniel Bruce. I'm from Haverford College. I was wondering with the extent to classified information in the U.S. and given the discussion about public image and international relations, do you think that the extent that we have classified information does more harm than good for the U.S.? And are there any possible solutions to that?
Well, I think certain information has to remain classified. I mean, many of you in this audience have worked with classified information. Certainly, Admiral Gunn is, but I've always believed that we classify too much. I think a lot of information that we classify doesn't need to be classified, and that's just not in military or diplomatic intelligence. I think that you can open some of that up. If you could do that, I think that cuts right to the issue of trust and confidence the American people have in their government and their leaders. I think we have too many secrets. And when you have secrets, there's always a reaction and a response to secrets. What's he hiding? They're not telling us everything. Why is that? There's something going on. And now over the last few years, and especially now with social media and with fake news, I mean, everything is open to questioning and interpretation. And I used to tell my people at the Pentagon, as he knows, Andrew knows, and I used to say it in the staff, in meetings in the Senate, there are no secrets. There sure as hell are no secrets in Washington. And if you think you're getting away with something, you're not. Something will, and I think present-day American politics is making my point for me, whether it's phone calls or whatever it is. There are no secrets. So you better play it straight. As much as you can declassify and bring out straightforward to the public, that just breaks down a lot of the intrigue that politicians, not all, but certain politicians use, and others who are interested in their own interests use to conflate and confuse and distract and distort for their own interests. So that's the way I would answer that question.
Maybe one quick more question, and we'll have the panel come up.
And you're leaving them all for the panel. That's good. I want to also just mention that Mohamed Younis, who you will hear from, is with Gallup, and I've known Mo for many years, worked with him, still do, and it's a real privilege to be up here with Mo, because Mo is one of the best. He's one of the best, and not at all short-circuiting the rest of the panel, because I know of their reputations and I know who they are, and they too fit in Mo's category. But I know Mo, and I think he owes me money. I don't know if but I know Mo. Thank you. But thank you all very, very much.
Now we'll ask Matthew Wallen and the panelists to come up and get your mics set up. And a quick thank you to Matthew for pulling together this really excellent report. It's been a passion project of his for most of this year, writing this, working on this, talking to experts about it. So I'm really pleased with how it came about, and I think ASP as a whole is really pleased. We think it's going to have a real impact on American public diplomacy and directions forward. So with that, over to you, Matthew. I'll let you lead us off, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Report's been a long time in the works. You know, I suppose in some way or another, I think I've been, thinking about this issue for at least the past decade. Probably around the time where I decided to go to grad school and study public diplomacy, figure out why it is that our message wasn't getting across. I'm not the only one who's thought about this. People have been writing about this for many years. I think to some degree there's well, some agreement on the problem, at least on the academic side. When it comes to practitioners and policymakers, some of them acknowledge the problem, but there seems to be what I would say a consensus between them that it's often about talking louder or explaining ourselves better. You know, some of the questions about why are we out-communicated by people in caves or by the Russians and the Chinese, these questions haven't stopped. You know, the United States hasn't had a really clear message since the end of the Cold War. But it's really only since 9/11 that we realized that we're basically not doing a great job. And I would say during that post-war period, we went through several different phases of what our messages were, and I could summarize sort of briefly. You know, the 90s, I think, amounted to the internet is great and your local genocide is confusing. By the early 2000s, we had sort of agreed that terrorism was bad. By the Iraq War, it was more of a we'll invade you, evildoer. By 2008, it was hope and change, which is really positive, but the reality was we would have neither hope nor change. And by 2016, we've arrived at America First, which basically states that, yeah, you might matter, but not until we've taken care of our business first. Now, to a certain degree, that's legitimate. You know, every nation is out there to look after its own interests. But I think the way you convey that and the way you pursue that, especially in your verbiage, really matters. So we've assembled a panel here to discuss a lot of the issues. I'm going to touch on them before jumping into everybody. I want to introduce the panel. We have Mohamed Younis, who's the editor-in-chief of Gallup, where he manages the direction of analysis and research, featured on Gallup's digital news page. For the past 10 years, Mohamed has led some of Gallup's largest global and regional studies on social, political, and economic issues. His research at Gallup has focused on geopolitics and the shifting global order, U.S. foreign policy, state stability, youth employment, and relations between Muslim communities and Western societies. We also have Dokhi Fassihian, who's the executive director of Reporters Without Borders in USA. Before joining Reporters Without Borders, she led the Middle East and North Africa division at Freedom House, where she oversaw the organization's regional portfolio. Fassihian also led the Democracy Coalition Project, where she monitored the state of democracy and human rights around the world and tracked the foreign policy of governments on international human rights policies. And very pertinent to our discussion today, she's also worked on elections, civil rights in the post-9/11 period, and U.S. national security. And finally, rounding out our panel, we have Dr. John Glenn, who's the policy director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. He joined the U.S. GLC after serving as director of foreign policy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where he led Transatlantic Trends, which is an annual survey of foreign policy attitudes in the United States and Europe, and oversaw GMF's foreign policy grant-making and programming. His background also includes academic expertise as the executive director of the Council of European Studies and project manager at the Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. So I'd like to thank you all again for being here. I want to identify a few of the problems and issues that we're looking at and sort of set the tone for the issues we'll be jumping into. When trying to figure out what is the American message, what should it be, I ultimately concluded that, well, we already have a good message. It's there, it's written, it's in the founding documents. It's really a matter of how we apply them and how we adhere to them. A particular note which was brought to my attention where there's a statement in the Declaration of Opinion and Declaration of Independence in just the first few lines that states there needed to be a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. We needed to justify our actions to the rest of the world. By many measures, I don't think we're sufficiently achieving these things. We're not adhering to these ideals, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. You know, just in the First Amendment alone, and yes, these freedoms are all upheld by the subsequent amendments that create the girder system that support them. But in many ways, we're just not upholding our end of the bargain. And it's not just us that is noticing it. It's the rest of the world. If you look at things like happiness, which is in, again, the first few lines of the Declaration of Independence, we don't rank in the top 10 around the world. No, it could, when you look at 190 countries, it looks relatively high, but for a country that literally states this in the founding document, we could be doing better. We rank 48th in press freedom, and Dokhi will be discussing this more. And again, with press freedom in our First Amendment, that's a shocking number. The Cato Institute ranks us 17th in human freedom. Freedom House ranks us 33rd in political rights and civil liberties. And 51% of people around the world don't believe that the U.S. respects the personal freedoms of its people. We've seen also large increases in the percentages of people that see the U.S. as posing a threat. And just to put that in perspective, that's about half the people in both Germany and France feel that the U.S. is a threat. 46% in our northern neighbor, Canada. 2/3 of people in our Mexico, our closest neighbors that we're negotiating trade agreements with right now. And in Japan, a country that we helped reshape, I would say quite admirably after the Second World War, 2/3 of people rank us as a threat. And when we compare this to some of our competitors, say Russia and China, if you look at ratings and perceptions and favorability of American leadership, we're all around the same number at around 31% favorability. So that's something I think we need to be paying close attention to. So to sort of summarize the problems and then jump into some of the data around this and some of the discussion, I feel that we're not upholding our values, and by doing so, it would make a large difference in perceptions overseas. And we have to keep in mind that when I say this, it's not just what we say overseas, it's what we're actually doing at home. And I don't want to get into like some sort of social justice warrior rant, but when you look at some of the stuff that's going on the social side of what's happening in this country, whether that's officer-related shootings, the criminal justice, which thankfully has undergone some much-needed reform, people are seeing this in real time. It's no longer filtered through the news. People see it all the time on their phones. So it's hard to insulate an American message that says, well, look, we're working to improve this while people still see it happening on a daily basis across their Facebook and Twitter feeds. We're constantly berating the alliances and the institutions for which we fought, and Secretary Hagel pointed this out quite aptly, that those 10 years in which we helped construct the liberal international order, where we decided that there was going to be a new way of doing things in the world, where we weren't going to remain as occupiers and tell other countries what to do. We were going to help build consensus around the world on how to move forward. We're constantly berating these institutions. Our own government is dysfunctional. I mean, we're all here in DC. I think we can see that quite plainly. But when we're trying to work on democracy promotion in other countries, whether that's Afghanistan or other places around the world, it becomes very difficult to argue for a certain way of doing things or following rule of law when we're in such a mess that we are right now. Our own politicians don't agree on the facts. Congress is a mess. I think our own approval rating of Congress is somewhere around 20%. So in some way, who are we to tell the rest of the world how to do this? I think if we were doing it effectively, we'd be in a better position to do that. We've also faced what I would say is somewhat of an inability to win. And this gets back to a lot of the adventures over the past 15 years. It's been a long time since we've solidly won a conflict. And I think there's several reasons for that. War is fought in a different way nowadays. The nature of warfare has changed. But at the same time, we haven't set realistic goals for ourselves when engaging in these conflicts. If we had understood the countries or heeded our own warnings internally about them better, then we may have set different expectations as to what we set as goals for that. So how do we define winning? Some people have said we've defeated ISIS. That's clearly not necessarily true. I say we've made great progress. But when you look at a situation like Afghanistan, where we've been there for 18 plus years, and it's questionable how much progress we've made, I think that emboldens people who see us as defeatable in some sense, that that people with an AK-47 can rise up and defeat the invader. I think we just have to take a lot more care as to how we engage in these conflicts and set long-term goals to how to end them. If you say, oh, I only want to be here for 10 years, that's a problem. You really need to look for the long term. And finally, I think we no longer appear to be a reliable partner, and that's for several reasons. That's for some of the reasons I mentioned before about berating our alliances. People question our commitment to NATO, which I think is incredibly dangerous when the entire premise of that organization depends on every country's commitment to the defense of other nations. And our word is losing meaning in this. When we sign diplomatic agreements and there's questions about treaties versus memorandums of understanding versus generic international agreement, when we pull out of those wholesale, what's to stop either the next administration from doing the same thing or from the very people that were negotiating from looking at the United States and saying, well, you're just going to pull out of this 4 years from now. Why are we going to sign it in the first place? I think that makes negotiating these deals very, very difficult. It weakens our negotiating resolve. So I'm going to stop right there and lend it to the rest of our panel. Mohamed, you've looked a little bit at the numbers and how people are actually viewing us. So when I say people are questioning the United States when they're worried about our direction, what's some of the data that you've found?
Well, I actually want to start kind of at home and where you ended. Certainly there's a lot of data out there that show exactly what you mentioned in your piece, the disappointment, the frustration in both allied nations as well as nations that are not considered very close allies of the United States with U.S. foreign policy, et cetera. But you made a comparison to 9/11, and I think what's really different from 9/11 to this moment here in America is the way Americans view their own government. Today, 76% of Americans think that corruption is widespread in their own government here at home. Confidence in the federal government to solve domestic problems is at an all-time low. So if we ask, do you have confidence in the federal government to solve domestic problems? People that basically say they have no confidence at all today is at 60% for domestic problems. So 6 out of 10 Americans basically don't think the federal government can solve domestic problems. It's a little bit better for international problems. 50% of Americans have no confidence. Just for a point of reference, and we've been polling the US public in some parts of the world since the 1930s. In 1974, that same exact question, does the federal government, do you have confidence in it to solve domestic problems? It was at 44% of people that said they had no confidence. So we went from 44% in Nixon that said they had no confidence to 60% today saying they have no confidence. Are you satisfied with the way things are going in the United States? Today, 1/3 of Americans are satisfied with the way things are going in the United States. I mean, 7 out of 10 people are not satisfied. The last time a majority of people were satisfied was 2004. So it's, there's a lot of focus on the current administration and maybe the rhetoric that's unfolding, but a lot of these challenges really predate this administration, and to many of the metrics that we've been gathering really go back to 2008 and the aftermath of that. And I hope we can get into that. I know our focus is foreign policy, but I think it's a really critical part of how we present capitalism to the world as well. Asking Americans what the most important problem that the country is facing, we've asked this question since the 1930s. A really interesting thing is that the most likely response for the past several months, actually for over now a year, has been poor government and poor leadership. So 1/3 of Americans in an open-ended question, what is the most important problem facing America? Volunteer, government, or poor leadership. What's interesting about that is when you ask that same question and you divide it sort of by Democrats and Republicans, it's even higher. 38 to 40% of those people say poor government and poor leadership. The challenge is they're doing this. So Democrats are blaming Republicans and Republicans are blaming Democrats. So I think before we kind of examine how the world views us, especially now because the world is more connected than ever, and whether you're physically here or not, you can get a really good idea of what's happening in America on social media. We need to start with kind of how we view ourselves. I think one of the huge mistakes we made after 9/11 in how we engage the world is we really focused on buzzwords. So today, it's really hard for me to imagine what the word democracy means to a 20-year-old Afghan citizen who just had an election, indecisive, situation is in shambles, I don't really know what that word means to them. Definitely don't think it means the same thing as it meant to people across Eastern Europe a couple generations ago. I don't know what capitalism means for a lot of millennials who are living in this sort of post-2008 era. Today in America, people who are 18 to 38 are as likely to have a positive view of capitalism as socialism. And that is a pretty dramatic change since previous generations. So there hasn't been a huge growth in people's love of socialism. There's actually been a dramatic decline in younger people's belief or positive views of capitalism. When you think about the free press, and I'll kind of make this my last point, and I think perfectly hand it off to Dokhi, the free press doesn't mean the same thing it meant in the 1980s when we were in the middle of the Cold War. So I'd mentioned President Nixon. When President Nixon was being impeached, 72% of Americans said they had trust in the honesty and basically the veracity of the news media that they have access to, 72%. Today, 41% of Americans share that view. So 6 in 10 Americans don't feel like the news they get access to is basically doing what it's supposed to be doing, informing them. So when we preach to the world about free press, what does that mean? And these challenges, again, I know, we're kind of living in a very unique historic moment here in the city, but these challenges really do transcend this administration and the rhetoric of this administration. The way we like to think about it at Gallup, because of what the data have really shown us, is a lot of the messages you hear in the news media coming from both sides are really only there because they ring true to some degree with a pretty significant part of the population. So when you have 76% of Americans saying corruption is widespread in government, it's not surprising that people start questioning the reliability of facts. It's not surprising that people start saying things like, well, so what if there was a favor? Everybody does that anyway. There's this perception out there that that's just the way it is. I'll just close with this. It's unique that when you compare it to local government, it's a totally different story. So Americans are very positive on their local government. They don't see corruption in their local government. They feel plugged into local government. And they give their local government and their own Congress representative a very high rating. So there's a really big difference between how Americans view the federal government and local government. And with that, I'll hand it to Dokhi.
Thank you very much. It's interesting the statistic you used about the trust in the news and in the media. And in the 1970s, that number was very different. I think it was 75% of Americans trusted the media. And so we see a real decline in public trust in the media in this country, which is a real concern. So I'm going to talk about freedom of the press, both here in the United States, traditionally and today, and how the change in freedom of the press in this country has impacted the world around us. We all know that the U.S. has long been considered a champion of the free press. The First Amendment model has been something that many countries around the world have aspired to, including democracies around the world. Unfortunately, this administration has significantly departed from this tradition. And we've lost a lot of the credibility that we did have on freedom of the press and promoting human rights overall around the world. It's quite hard to take seriously a government promoting freedom of the press like the United States still tries to do when it comes to certain governments when it's abandoned that commitment to some degree at home. Between 2017 and 2019, the United States dropped 5 places to 48th place out of 180 countries around the world. It is now classified as a problematic country for journalists to work in, which is really should come as a huge shock to us. Let's look at why. Over the past couple of years, journalists in the United States have experienced harassment, death threats. Those who have been reporting at Trump rallies have been physically accosted. Many have said that they're afraid to go to these rallies. Local and national newsrooms have received bomb threats and suspicious packages. An example is in November 2018, after 40 calls, harassing calls to CNN journalist Don Lemon, There were bomb threats and suspicious packages that came to CNN. In June 2018, in maybe one of the most horrific attacks on the press in this country, a gunman entered the Capitol Gazette newsroom in Annapolis, Maryland, and killed 5 staff. This particular person was holding a grudge against this newspaper for their coverage of him. Between August 2017 and today, the US Press Freedom Tracker, who was set up actually to start tracking these terrible incidents, has recorded 100 physical attacks and more than 50 arrests of journalists in the United States. In March 2019, NBC in San Diego revealed that the United States government has used a secret database to monitor and arrest journalists reporting from the US-Mexico border. This follows a number of incidents of CBP harassing journalists and conducting invasive searches of their electronic devices. For the first time ever, journalists have been repeatedly denied access to government press conferences, briefings, and election polling sites. The last official White House press briefing that we had was 6 months ago. We rarely have any State Department briefings or Defense Department briefings anymore. We all know about what happened to Jim Acosta of CNN and Brian Karem of Playboy, whose press passes were revoked or suspended by the White House because they challenged the president. This is really not normal in the United States. And really unlike anything we've ever seen in the United States, the attacks on press freedom are taking place in an enabling political environment thanks to the infamous fake news rhetoric of President Donald Trump. This rhetoric began before his taking over the presidency, but it's continued throughout the presidency and intensified. At least 1 fake news tweet per month and more than 600 since Election Day, according to the New York Times. But it's more than just fake news that Donald Trump has accused news organizations and independent outlets of being the enemy of the people and accused them of treason. And he's even shared a doctored video on his Twitter account that portrayed him punching a man with CNN imposed on his face. If this is not incitement to violence against the press, I don't know what is. It's become so normalized for us now that most of us hardly pay attention anymore, pointing to the fact that these are just distractions, that Donald Trump is using this to distract from other things. But this is having a very, very, very serious impact on our public and its trust in the media. We know the term fake news has dark origins rooted in Nazi Germany, where a similar term was used, Lügenpresse, to discredit the independent media in that country. Today, despots and democratic leaders alike are borrowing fake news to discredit the press at a time when trust in the media is already low and genuine misinformation and disinformation is rampant on the internet. The problem is the term fake news is not being used to actually fight disinformation. It's being used to discredit authentic reporting. And its impact extends far outside the United States. So we haven't just lost a United States that's lost moral authority when it comes to freedom of the press. We have a US president now who's actively promoting rhetoric reminiscent of Adolf Hitler to discredit the press. And this rhetoric is actually being used widely overseas. Since Trump's election, more than 40 foreign governments have deployed the phrase fake news against journalists, according to the New York Times. We saw this with the Chinese government recently accused the New York Times of fake news for its stunning report of the Chinese government's internment camps of Uyghur Muslims. In Morocco, journalist Rabi al-Ablaq is currently in prison on a June 2018 conviction of spreading fake news. In March 2019, the government of Burundi used fake news to explain why it was banning the BBC. In February, Jordan introduced legislation that would allow the government to punish journalists for publishing false news, and a similar law has gone into effect in Singapore in October. Fake news is a weapon being used to discredit reports of abuse of power, corruption, human rights violations all over the world. And its widespread use comes right back to the President of the United States. Since 2017, RSF has documented that 194 journalists have been killed, and the number of journalists in prison has consistently risen, with right now 384 detained, arbitrarily detained. Perhaps the most horrific symbol of what's happening to journalists around the world is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, Virginia resident and columnist, of the Washington Post. This administration did nothing to hold the Saudi government accountable for that murder. Such impunity sends a green light to dictators around the world to do the same thing, and it contributes to the stark numbers I outlined above. American journalists are not immune to this. In 2017, the New York Times received a phone call that its reporter, Declan Walsh, was going to be arrested in Egypt. This diplomat knew that his own government, the American government, was not going to protect an American journalist from arrest in Egypt, so he had to take other measures. So it's open season on journalists around the world, including in the United States, and all of us are impacted. Threats to journalists are a direct threat to our right to know and our abilities to hold governments accountable. Thank you.
You've been working across the U.S. that you found in your work the lens to this discussion.
Thank you very much. And let me thank both my panelists. What a sobering place to come in beforehand. Let me thank ASP as well for, I want to acknowledge a very diverse panel, not only in our backgrounds, but in our professional approaches to this. And I think that brings a real richness to the conversation. If I can, I'd like to talk a little bit about the advocacy work that the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition is doing, advocating for America's leadership in the world, and in particular for diplomacy and development, the civilian side alongside of our defense and the military. I want to make a short observation, talk about USGLC, and then look ahead. The observation when we talk about messaging there is I want to flag the phrase that gets used occasionally in this about the need for a new narrative. And at the risk of sounding a little academic, I want to contrast that between the idea about what we need is more information. Michael, you began and you said sort of, if people don't feel understood oftentimes, they think what they need to do is say it again and say it louder. When in fact, I think what I draw on is from the framing theory, from cognitive science and sociology, which suggests that people organize the world in a series of frames. That is how they see the world, and the information that they receive is fundamentally filtered through that. George Lakoff and Frank Luntz show that if you give people information that doesn't fit the frame, they throw away the information, not the frame. One of the ways that my organization advocates is, one of the things is around the issue of foreign assistance. So foreign assistance is 1% of the federal budget. But there's a great story about the pollster Stephen Cull from the University of Maryland who says, he asked people, how much do you think we spend on foreign assistance? And maybe those of you in the audience, and everybody says, 20%. And he says, well, it's 1%. That part we know. But in a conversation with him, he told me that, so then they continued on the survey for another 15 minutes about global issues. And at the end of the survey, he said, let me ask you again, how much do you think we spend on foreign assistance? And they said, 20%. He said, but I told you it was 1%. And they said, yeah, I didn't believe you. And I think there's this real issue around understanding that it's not merely more facts alone that we need, but it's a narrative that weaves together who we are and what we do. And a lot of this draws on the lessons of strategic communication. I feel like one of the things I've learned moving from the policy realm into sort of more the advocacy realm are some of the insights from strategic communication. And this is not just marketing, but the way that sometimes in our conversations we act as if there is a single message or that we need to deliver to some people out there who are supposed to get it. When I think what's rich about this conversation and about the report you did is the acknowledgement that audiences at home and abroad are diverse and they respond differently, especially in an era of polarization and media fragmentation. So let me then talk, if I can, for a brief second about the US Global Leadership Coalition, because what's interesting, I think, is that we're a coalition of over 500 businesses and NGOs who come together. It was actually founded in 1995, right at that period after the Cold War when we were hoping for that peace dividend and thought we could just pull back from the world. But it's, I don't know, Google, Procter & Gamble, Land O'Lakes, Walmart, and Caterpillar alongside Save the Children, Bread for the World, and CARE. And we've crafted a narrative, and I, of course, will credit my president and founding director, Liz Schreier, for whom I am standing in today. Around a bipartisan message, I like working for an organization that says we have every living Secretary of State from Henry Kissinger to John Kerry on our board. Secretary Hagel has served on our board. We have a group of now over 200 retired 3 and 4 flag and general officers, such as Admiral Gunn, who join us to advocate in this this message around the country, and we tend to break it down in 3 ways. It's part of a broad message, but there's a national security case, an economic prosperity case, and a piece around our core values. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more, but this sort of emphasis on 3 different sort of approaches to it shape how we advocate. Here in DC, our main work is actually around the international affairs budget, engaging Congress. So you've surely seen, if you're here in Washington over the past 3 years, these proposals to cut the State Department and USAID 30 to 25%. We've been trying to engage Congress on both sides of the aisle to say that's not a good idea, frankly, especially in today's world of crises. And I will say we've had some success in pushing back against them and trying to hold that bipartisan commitment on the Hill, even at a time when things are tough. But outside the country, we're active in about 30 states. And when we're out there, we're really not having a budget conversation, although we talk about it, but it's really a conversation about America's role in the world. And I think, and it's there, I find people hungry to talk about this today. And it's there where those 3 messages, national security, economic prosperity, and core values come in. You know, the short version is I feel like since 9/11, everybody knows that what happens in some of the poorest countries around the world can affect us very directly at home. And when I travel with someone like Admiral Gunn, who can tell the story about his service in uniform, it's very powerful. On the economic side, I love to say I was in Green Bay, Wisconsin once, there with a meeting with someone from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. It was about 30 people, 25 people who came, and 3 local chambers of commerce showed up. And I had no idea there were 3 local chambers. And they said, sure, we've got Green Bay, Oshkosh, and 3 Rivers. And I said, well, that's great. I mean, what brings you to us today? And they said, oh, our businesses know. I mean, markets are global. And they're interested in anything that you can offer that would help them understand how to engage and how to export and sell their goods. I thought, even in a place like this, I wouldn't have expected. And that around our core values is sort of the place that I would say, look, most Americans, when they try to understand at least these issues around, say, you know, global poverty and the issues around the world, they encounter them first in their churches, their parishes, their synagogues, where they come, stories of missions that they do. And this kind of focus on, we do this because it's the right thing to do, is, frankly, the further away you get from DC, the more important that is. We engage as well the 2020 candidates on all sides. I'm going to merely refer to a paper on our website that my boss wrote, which is an open letter to the candidates called What Your Pollsters May Not Know About America and Foreign Policy, in which she brings together 3 things that we've found. You know, the argument today when we're trying to engage candidates, you could expect, and this was true in 2012 and 2016 when I did this work, is they're like, foreign policy issues aren't exactly what drive voters. You know, why should I talk about that? We want to talk about jobs and healthcare. And of course, they do. So today's version of it is, it's not a kitchen table issue. And so we've been engaging people and sort of come up with, and I'm just going to name them again. I'd be happy in the discussion to go into more. But Liz likes to say the 3 ways if you do this, it's the economy, stupid. And everybody knows 95% of the world's consumers are outside the borders of the United States. We should be selling our stuff there. And frankly, diplomacy and development help build in open markets. Secondly, the era of great power competition. While part of this administration's national security strategy is, I think, something people feel across the board. I have to say I'm really struck when you talk about if America doesn't lead, others will. Really resonates with folks. And I'm honestly, just as a policy guy, often struck by if I talk about the role of China in Africa, heads start nodding when I'm not sure they're heads who have ever been to China or to Africa. But it sort of fits into a sense about, wait, that's right, that's the challenge we face. And lastly, the focus on the need to prevent the next war. And here's the national security case where folks like Admiral Gunn are especially helpful. But one of our members whom I had the honor of recruiting was a certain Jim Mattis, in between his service in uniform and as Secretary of Defense. And I'm sure you've all seen that great quote of, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I have to buy more ammunition. And when his members of the National Security Advisory Council quote that, they add, and even then it won't be enough. So we like to say that there's a third of the people out there who are already on board. We're actually not very active in California or New York. It would be great to do so, but we're a small organization, but they're kind of with us. We're not that active in the third of the country that they're really not with us. You know, we don't have that much in sort of deep red America. We're not in, from following the figures in Oklahoma. Maybe we should be, but we're a small organization, so we tend to be active in what we call purple America. And those are the folks who I think are interested in this, believe it, but they need a little bit of help, and they want to know about the return of investment. And it's things like, and I'll just give one example before I wrap up here and say, you know, when you say, listen, 11 out of 15 of our top trading partners are former recipients of US foreign assistance. Everybody goes, huh. And now I want to come back to the part I said about framing. That phrase builds in a frame of a message, of a vision of what this is for. You know, when I say it that way, I'm saying not just we give money because it's out of the kindness of our hearts, but it's kind of a vision of what we want to do. We want to build partners. We want to build economies. We want to build people to trade with and people to work with there. And it's that kind of focus on that what I'd like to. Now, really briefly, when I've been thinking about this issue, I keep feeling like I've been in Washington just long enough. It's 15 years now that I'm thinking about the last time we talked about this, which was around the decline of the image of the United States around the war in Iraq. And I'm remembering 2008, a time when the president left office with a 22% approval rating. The image around of the United States in the world was in negative figures, and we had another president come in and say, I'm going to restore America's trust and credibility. And a couple of things, if I think, what do we do going forward? The first is I feel like that lesson suggests that it won't be enough just to go around the world and say, America's back, you can trust us again. I think President Obama tried to do that. And it was challenging. He ran into some pretty significant challenges of partisanship at home. Remember the apology tour charges to him? So if I was talking to the next president, I'd say, how are we going to get around that issue, the so-called apology tour? We obviously have to go beyond words to cooperation. Every one of the candidates who are seeking to contest the current president say they will rejoin the Paris Accords, and most of them say the Iran deal as well. But it's really not going to be enough, I think, for just sort of rejoining to come back where we were. My questions are, will we be able to craft a new consensus on trade? Could there be a TPP 2.0 or a transatlantic version TTIP 2.0? What would it mean? And frankly, I think the foreign policy community, we got to get a lot smarter on economics. TPP, I think we won the security argument. We have to counter China, work with the agent. You know, that once won, but we lost the economic argument at home. And if we're going to get smarter on that, we've got to get better at doing those things together. So in conclusion there, I hope you saw this week around the NATO summit, a friend and colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, Ivan Krastev, wrote a piece in the New York Times that was titled, How Can Europeans Ever Trust America Again? In which he said, these days US elections seem more like regime change rather than sort of assuming a bipartisan commitment to internationalism. And the last two thoughts I have, and I'm still trying to figure it out, so I'm not sure I'm right here, but they might be one counterintuitive point and one sort of perhaps less so. But when looking at rebuilding America's trust and continuity, I have the feeling that it may be important to emphasize more continuity with America than rupture if there's a new president in 2020. To the extent that which we emphasize a rupture, I worry that we reinforce this sense that we're no longer reliable. It's this one or it's that one. It's this one or it's that one. How can we come up with a narrative that does so? And I remember President Obama sort of encountering tremendous disappointment in his European allies when it was true that he was still going to be concerned about terrorism and used drone strikes as a tool to do so. Maybe some of you remember the scandal over transatlantic trust in spying that came up because they were disappointed that somehow he was supposed to be totally different than George W. Bush. I think we need to think about how we tell that better. And lastly, for a new president, and this really is my last point, I think we've got to be able to do something about getting congressional buy-in. You know, if you think about Paris and you think about the Iran deal, as Michael suggested in there, I mean, they're agreements, they're not treaties. Now, it's a little bit Pollyannish of me to say that, because I've seen this Congress. And I know what we're talking about here. But if there was a way to start by, I don't know, could the next president bring Democratic and Republican leaders with him on a discussion about America being back? Could they identify, if not the big picture, some pieces whereby the commitments that are being made by the next American president are bound up and supported by commitment back at home in Congress? Now that would be a way to restore America's credibility in the leadership role of the president. Thank you.
So the paper's really, really long. I hope some of you have time to read it. There's a summary that's available in the back, but I just want to touch on some of the points about what we can actually do about all this. First is closing the say-do gap. That is, when we commit to something, we have to do it. When we say something, we have to do it. When we do something, we need to make sure that we're using the words that support those actions. If we can't make the promise, we shouldn't make the promise. I think the Obama administration ran into this on a number of issues. For instance, closing Guantanamo, that ran into congressional opposition. It shouldn't have been promised. We need to actively listen to the world, and there's lots of academic writing on what listening means, but there's a few things. In addition to providing us the information that we need in order to make sound policies, those common set of facts, those perceptions about how our policies are going to be reacted to. It's about creating trust, as Secretary Hagel mentioned earlier. Trust is the foundation of our relationships overseas, and if people don't trust us, why are they going to agree to do anything with us? It creates value, which is really important. We need to not only, when we're pursuing America first, we have to understand that the people that we are trying to reach also want to achieve their objectives too. The better we understand what it is that they're getting at or that they want, the better we can factor that in and help give them part of what they might think that they need so that they can save face and have value in the relationship. Fundamentally, this nation needs to recommit to the truth. And there's all sorts of ideas of truth, whether that's with a capital or a lowercase t, but it's about really the common facts that we're using to make policy decisions. Russia and China are out there spreading massive amounts of disinformation. I think it is incredibly difficult for the State Department or other representatives of our government to get out there and push for foreign policies when we are also spreading disinformation, whether that's on climate change or whether Ukraine interfered in the election. And that's not to comment on the current impeachment situation that's going on, but it's about the facts. If you were arguing that a country did something, you were using those facts to create a foreign policy towards that country. We can't fall into the trap of doing the easy lying that Russia and China do. We need to maintain our leadership in science. Science, science, science. It is the foundation for everything going forward. I don't necessarily think there's disagreements between science and religion and that type of thing. That's up for individuals to determine. But in terms of dealing with the physical world and how we change it, science is fundamentally important. We need to do the things that are big. We talk about the Apollo mission, and the State Department did amazing things in promoting that accomplishment around the world. We need to keep thinking about those big things, and we need to lead. We need to learn from the world. We need to send more Americans abroad. Right now, 3 times as many people come to the U.S. to study as Americans go abroad. So we need to figure out ways to incentivize that and get people out there to learn the best information that's there and bring it back home. We really need to remain steadfast on our commitments. Again, this is about closing the say-do gap a bit. But when we commit to doing something, especially if that's in the form of a treaty, we should be sticking to that. We should not be the country that is pulling out of treaties unless it is absolutely 100% undeniably in our national interest to do so. If we're known as a treaty breaker around the world, this gets back to the issue I was discussing earlier about how do we actually negotiate those agreements in the first place. We're good on to a certain extent on freedom of the individual conceptually in the way we write about it. I think there's a fundamental disagreement in this country about what freedom actually means. And we need to really have a close, at-home, public, every way we can discuss what this concept of freedom means, I think is important for the way we pursue it overseas. Touching on some of the things that the panel mentioned about working more with folks around the world, we need to act as an enabler. We need to help people get their own voices, to fight for their own issues, to fight for their own needs. The GEC at the State Department does a little bit of this in the way they help train people to do social media and how to set up arguments and get their message out. But at the same time, we have to understand not everybody around the world can have the American dream. So the more that we work to enable them, whether that's economically or politically, the more benefit that has for our message. And when those people are enabled and they've made successful economies at home, those become markets for American goods and American diplomacy and other aspects of America. We need to collaborate better with our allies. All these situations that we're facing around the world, whether that's dealing with terrorism or nuclear non-proliferation or even climate change, none of these can be solved by one country alone. We have to involve the world, and we have to lead to get everybody on the same page about how to deal with these. And sort of finally, I want to touch on the refugee and migrant situation. This is only going to get worse as time goes on, as it's exacerbated by things like climate change, political upheaval, shortages on food, increased populations, and the strains that causes. We do need to enforce our borders and maintain our sovereignty. I don't think that is in doubt. That is important for the sanctity of any country. But at the same time, we need to set an example about how to treat these people as they're coming across the border, and to do these other things that I mentioned to reduce the strain for those people, the reasons that they need to migrate. This is going to only get worse. It's going to increase, and it's going to increase by a factor of many. We're going to see billions of refugees over the next 50 years, and we need to really set an example, not only here, but for the rest of the world on how to do this. Europe is already facing this in many ways, just from climate and strife alone. So I think that's important. With that all in mind, I think we're really at a tipping point here, especially when it comes to credibility. When we talk about common facts, the amount of disinformation that's out there, the way that it spreads. There's been sayings that truth spreads, or lies spread faster than truth. The actual data that you see on it nowadays is frightening, and it reaches people at a speed and rate and volume much greater than I think we've ever seen in history. And if we don't make a choice, a conscious choice to stand apart from Russia and China and determine and basically choose that there is a such thing as truth, and that we are not going to be a lying country, that we're not going to spread disinformation. I think that's really important to make that stand nowadays, so that when people are confused by the amount of information that's out there, they can turn to a reliable source. So with that in mind, I think we've had a lot to say. I want to open it up to the audience for Q&A, and let's get to it.
Hi, my name is Max Min. I'm a PhD student at GW in US Diplomatic History. Thank you for the panel. It was like really intellectual food. I have a question, Professor Glenn. You insisted about bipartisanship and also non-partisanship. I'm sorry for my accent. I'm from France, by the way. You mentioned France, so anyway. So don't you think that there is also a crisis and a lack of bipartisanship for the past, I would say, 30 years, when Congress, even you talk about Mr. Younis about 74, and there was agreement that the president was doing something wrong in terms of foreign affairs, and since then we didn't really see a Congress who would be able to just face really the challenge of foreign affairs, and even more now because everything is partisan. So it's my first question, if there is a crisis. And the second question is, don't you think that we have, but it's for everyone, don't you think that we have also to educate people in terms of what the United States stands for abroad, and especially what is the message that the United States has to carry and all the values that they have to protect? Thank you.
So briefly, one could have an entire discussion about partisanship. I would adopt a little bit of nuance. I would not contest that we're in a very hyper-partisan moment right now. But when you say 30 years, I think I look back and see moments when the United States has come together. If I think about the way the United States came together after 9/11, in that moment, looking at the specific issue around addressing the challenge and the threat from Afghanistan, which I'm deliberately distinguishing from a decision to go to war in Iraq, I think when we came together. I think the United States has come together at other moments during that time. And then, in some ways, my discussion is premised on this somewhat idealized notion. I would certainly concede that Senator Vandenberg sort of first promulgated after World War II about the idea that politics stops at the water's edge. And it's an idealized notion of ours. It's easy to show examples that show it's never truly been really like that. But I think that it's in this area, whereas we are comfortable with allowing that at home we have disagreements about how we govern ourselves, but that we might try to present a more united front looking out. I think about the way that how easily those norms are lost. I had the honor of traveling a couple times to the Halifax International Security Forum, where the congressional delegation was co-chaired by John McCain. And John McCain was a model for sort of not bringing partisan comments into visions about the discussion of that. He came along with Senator Tim Kaine. So I feel like there's a tradition and a norm that, of course, there are instances in history that aren't, where it hasn't been lived up to. And then today, I would merely say, that's what I said at the end. I hoped about my idea that if Congress could come together around restoring America's credibility might seem a bit Pollyanna-ish. But I tell you, Our ability to push back against those cuts to the State Department and the USAID are only possible because there are leaders in the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle who've said, we may disagree on a lot of other things, but reducing our footprint by 30% in today's world, no, that's not the wise thing. We can then have a discussion about how we do it. But we've been able to keep some measure of that, even if sometimes it feels fragile. Maybe I'll let the panelists comment either on that or the other question.
I just add, one of the powerful things, and it relates to your question in your report, is really the show me, don't tell me concept. I take everything you said, and I agree with what you're saying. I think the challenge is from the international audience's perspective. They're a lot smarter than our messaging, marketing language a lot of times implies. What they know is their local life, their local realities. We've been polling now across the world since 2005, covering 98% of the world's population. One of the most kind of common sense, but really important findings we've come to is the only universal value is people want better opportunity for themselves and their family. And in the modern era, and this is what they tell us in our surveys, is basically everyone wants a great job. The more America can be tied to creating a great job in people's local reality, the more almost everything we're talking about is almost not even needed. Because that's the best diplomacy we could really offer. When we ask folks around the world what would improve relations with the United States, trade and jobs are always the #1 thing. Maybe if we ask it in the Palestinian territories, you get answers first about U.S. foreign policy. But in most of the world, aside from the Middle East, where there isn't a war happening, it does tie back to TPP and TTIP. It does tie back to the fact that I think George Washington, totally paraphrasing, said like the most honorable thing you could do within a nation is commerce, because it's basically the most respectful thing you can do is to exchange opportunity. But aside from sort of my very negative perception on Americans' views of their own government, we shouldn't mischaracterize where the American public is today. So today, Americans are overwhelmingly in favor of trade. And actually, with the exception of China, where a majority of Americans view the current arrangement with them as unfair, Americans have a very positive view of most of our largest trading partners, and most of them, of course, are here in the Western Hemisphere. NATO, Americans today are overwhelmingly supporting of NATO. It's actually at a historic high. NASA, you talked about science. Americans today are more likely than ever to say that NASA and efforts like that should continue to be funded. Even on immigration, 60% of Americans, over 60% of Americans, don't want to build a wall on the border. Over 60% of Americans also don't want to send everybody home who's undocumented. However, 7 in 10 Americans want more Border Patrol agents on the border. So people want the system to be fixed, but a lot of the rhetorical sort of talking points and javelins that we hear in the news are often not really supported by a majority of Americans. They're really just supported by a narrow base of whoever actor is kind of using that.
I think when you mention jobs and economics, I think that's an important part of it, especially as we're looking at how we're competing with the Chinese model. We think we should keep that in mind. I think we're running a little over. I think we've got time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. Back right. Sir, let's do 1 and 2.
Hi there. My question is primarily for you, Matthew, but for any of the other panelists as well. And that is, a lot of your recommendations that you outlined in the summary are sort of approaches or sort of changes in tack or narrative. But my question is sort of, you can have a great message and a great narrative, but if you don't have the right structures in place to be able to actually put forward that narrative, or even to, as you say, to listen more and listen better, a lot of this, the narrative or the message is kind of meaningless in the end. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on changes to structures within the U.S. public diplomacy sort of frameworks and institutions that we have that would sort of align with your recommendations on messaging and approaches.
All the way in the back.
My name is Briggs Burton. I'm with the Global Environmental Education Partnership. This was sort of touched on at the closing remarks of the panel, but I would like to ask how, as the climate crisis intensifies and its second and third order effects are felt, especially in the global south, how should American public diplomacy address, first of all, climate-specific issues, and second of all, sort of acknowledge and explain the effects of the climate crisis on issues like migration and things we don't normally view through an environmental lens?
So I'll touch briefly on the first question. That's a great question, and I was having a conversation with someone the other day about how we actually do listen, and we have the information that we need, and some people know it, it's just not getting all the way to the top. This is ultimately up to the individuals who are in that bureaucracy to decide whether this information is relevant to them or not. If you have the information and you choose to ignore it, then you do that at your own peril. To rectify some of these situations, I've got a line or two in the report that discusses this as something that I think we need, but the political reality makes it very unlikely that it will happen, is there needs to be some sort of governing or governmental body that challenges ourselves. Think of it almost like an inspector general for U.S. foreign policy at large, where it looks at the say-do gap and it looks at the policies we're doing and it's checking to see if those are consistent with what we're doing. It would need to be politically insulated, I should say, so that it's shielded from reprisal. And there's all sorts of details to work out on that. Again, it's questionable whether something like that would ever happen, but I think it gives us a little bit more legitimacy when we're creating policies and dealing with them and analyzing them. If the government is showing that it is doing that itself, as opposed to this being just a role for civil society, because the government, frankly, ignores civil society at large when it criticizes it. On climate, our organization writes quite a lot on this, but I'll leave it to anybody else in the panel who has comments on that.
The thing I'll highlight is for our work around foreign assistance, America's role in the developing world, the development side of the bigger picture there, we've, it's obviously an issue where the partisanship has been one, although I'm often taken by, perhaps hopefully, the idea that that's merely a generational issue, that will go away. But I think we often emphasize now two things. One, that the disproportionate effect of climate change is actually on the poorest and most vulnerable in the developing world, especially women and children. And in fact, the way that it becomes, as Admiral Gunn and others have taught me, a multiplier, a threat multiplier for many things that affect our own security directly at home as well, whether it be forced migrations, climate crises, food and water insecurity, and things that sort of require us to engage, and that it is both a recognition of the realities out there, but also the sort of way that this is bound up in our own sort of understanding of what we need to be, why we need to be engaged in the world, is a piece that we're trying to talk about it more, and in a way, hopefully, that can find some common ground among folks.
Can I add something about the public diplomacy part? We've even been engaging with some offices in Congress on possible so hopefully that will happen. It might not happen in this administration, but we'll see.
I'd like to thank you all for being here. Please check out our website if you want to read the report. It is on the front page as we speak. Again, thank you, Secretary Hagel, for coming and attending and speaking. And check out our website, www.americansecurityproject.org. Thank you very much.